Hello, good afternoon. My name is Saul Casson, and I am here to introduce our speaker. I am very, very pleased to introduce Gary Wells, a fellow of APS, speaking today as recipient of the James McKeen Cattell Fellow Award, this year's award, which honors individuals for their lifetime of significant intellectual achievement in applied psychological research and their impact on a critical problem in society at large. Gary is Distinguished Professor and Stavish Chair of the Social Science at Iowa State University. Trained in experimental social psychology, he pioneered contemporary theorizing and research on eyewitness identification and errors and the application to preventing wrongful convictions. In 1978, Wells introduced an essential distinction between system variables and estimator variables. Those system variables being those variables that the criminal justice system actually can control. He went on to identify concepts that are now universal in the popular culture, such as double-blind lineups. And by the way, there are at least a dozen other concepts that he doesn't get cited for anymore because they've just seeped into the popular culture, which in some ways I think is as good a measure of success as any. Wells has consistently been funded by National Science Foundation. Google Scholar shows 18,000 citations to his research, and that includes the US Supreme Court. In 1996, as forensic DNA testing started to uncover wrongful convictions, US Attorney General Janet Reno asked Gary Wells to lead a DOJ working group of police, prosecutors, and eyewitness researchers. This group went on to produce a transformative guide for law enforcement on how to collect eyewitness evidence. Wells then led a team that published the first official white paper of the American Psychology Law Society, a document that has served as a template for reform. More than anyone else, Wells has identified the problems with eyewitnesses and possible solutions. He has worked tirelessly with practitioners and policymakers to change the way eyewitnesses make identifications. He has raised public awareness through various news media. And I'd like to go off script for a moment because this award and being here to introduce Gary for it is personal. He is not just a brilliant colleague, he is a good friend. And I have admired his work for literally as long as I've been in this field. Last week I went back for a completely different reason to check the first paper I'd ever published in JPSP. It was in 1979. I was a year out of graduate school. And right there in the acknowledgement section, I was thanking one Gary L. Wells for thoughtful comments on an earlier draft of the manuscript. So even when we were kids. And the interesting thing was, I wasn't writing a law manuscript, and I wasn't citing him for a law manuscript. We were doing something else totally different in social psychology. Another interesting, again, slightly off script, but a story that I think is an important one. Gary's interest in eyewitness testimony started when he was in graduate school. And he had a mentor and an advisor who said, you know, it's okay if you want to play around with this a bit, kind of like a hobby, but, you know, don't take it too far. It's a dead end. Well, literally 40 years later, he has barreled through that dead end and produced a very rich and important science. The study of eyewitness identification represents, I think, some of the best application that psychology has to offer. And I don't think there's any question that nobody has shaped it more than Gary Wells. As the leading theoretician, researcher, reform advocate, spokesperson, he is synonymous with this science and all that it has accomplished. Please welcome Gary Wells.
Well, thank you, Saul. That guy sounds very interesting you were talking about there. I'd like to meet him someday. I'm very pleased to be here. I want to thank APS, certainly for the award. You know, it's a career award, so when I thought about, well, what should I emphasize? Because really, this is a huge literature now. What should I talk about? What should I emphasize? but it's a career award, and these career awards mean that you're old. And when you're old, so I thought about, well, what do people want to hear from an old guy? Well, what do they want to hear from an old rocker? The old stuff, the hits, right? Or the new stuff, right? So I'm going to give you mostly more of the hits. I'm going to talk about things that are highly replicable phenomena that I think that tell us a lot. I think they're simple, but they tell us a lot about what's going on in eyewitness identification. And I want to talk about some of the concepts and other kinds of things that have driven this field. But first, thanks to lots of people. You don't get this far alone. I mean, I remember in the 2008 presidential election when Barack Obama told these arrogant business world leaders that, you didn't make it completely on your own, right? And oh, did they object, right? No, we built it. Remember those chants, we built it, right? Well, did you build the internet to get there? Did you build the roads? Did you put in the sewer system? Blah, blah, blah. They didn't really do any of it. They just went along for the ride. And I kind of felt like at times I was going along for the ride. So I want to thank all of these PhD students who made very significant contributions over the years. I want to thank some of my more consistent colleagues here who I've published with, Neil Brewer and all of his students. I see some of Neil Brewer's students in here right now. Nancy Stably, Jim Dysart, my postdoc, Andrew Smith. But then there's all these other people. You can do the research and you can publish the research, but to have an impact, you need to reach out and be dealing with people who are in the legal system and who have some power within the legal system. And I was very fortunate to be able to do all of this. So Barry Scheck, Peter Neufeld, and all their people who began the Innocence Project in New York, I've worked with very closely. They've been very important to this effort of reaching out and changing the system. Attorney General Janet Reno, who died this last fall, was really prescient on this within the legal system. She became a good friend and a good friend to the cause. John Farmer, I say et al. John Farmer was the Attorney General of the state of New Jersey. There are many other Attorney Generals who I worked with in addition, because you have to bring these people into the effort to have an impact on the legal system. So I'm not listing them all, but John Farmer was the first. Chris Muma, at the state level, in this case North Carolina, but many other states after that, so that's an et al. Who headed up their innocence projects. Barbara Hervey, as an example of a state Supreme Court justice, in her case Texas, who had a huge impact in us getting changes in Texas and law enforcement and how they go about doing lineups and changes within their court system. But there are many other state Supreme Court justices that I've had the pleasure of working with. Barbara was among the first and that had a chain reaction. And then Sally Yates, some of you may know Sally Yates, who Sally Yates is. Sally Yates was the acting Attorney General who Trump fired early on, right? But before he fired her, she issued directives to the U.S. through the U.S. Department of Justice as Attorney General to all federal law enforcement agencies in the United States to follow the kinds of procedures that we have laid out for collecting and preserving eyewitness identification evidence. So there's all this stuff going on, all this support. It can't just be done with me. And then my major professor in graduate school, not the one who told me, get out of this area because it's going nowhere, but Anthony Greenwald. And then Elizabeth Loftus, a good friend, and I've published with her, and she has taught me a lot and inspired me a lot over the years. And then my wife of 48 years, Teresa Wells, who I think Teresa, are you here? I think she's skipping out. Oh, there she is. All right. So eyewitness identification evidence is a very important kind of evidence. And the reason it's such an important kind of evidence is because if an eyewitness says, that's the person I saw pull the trigger, commit the crime, or who assaulted me, that is direct evidence of guilt. Direct evidence of guilt. You know, almost all evidence is circumstantial, right? There's one other that's direct evidence of guilt, and that's confessions, which Saul does research on. And by direct evidence, what we mean is that if you believe that witness, right, then the person's guilty, by definition. You don't need to make any more connections. You don't have to work through anything else. Take something like fingerprints, even DNA. It's circumstantial. Okay, your fingerprint, we think that's your fingerprint, but there could be innocent reasons it gets there. You have to show that it got there for guilty reasons. There's a lot more steps involved, right? So this is very important. Most eyewitness identifications in this country happen with photos. I know it's more exciting to think about the live lineup, and television likes the live lineup like this, but that's less common. Some jurisdictions, like New York, use quite a few live lineups. Philadelphia used quite a few live lineups, but mostly, and then everything that I'll talk about today, all the principles, as far as we can tell, are the same whether it's a live lineup or a photographic lineup. And I want to start off where I think we should start off, and certainly among psychologists, and that is looking at the basic experimental method for studying eyewitness identification. I just want to lay it out there for those of you who might be unfamiliar, put it in your minds. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, really, you sitting in this room, if we hadn't made this up in the 70s, you would have made it. You could have easily made it up. It's pretty straightforward when you think about it. What happens is we create events for unsuspecting people, right? And because we created the event, we know exactly what happened. That's the beauty of this. We create events for unsuspecting people, so we know, for example, who the perpetrator is. We do this over and over again for large numbers of people because, like anything else, right, there are individual differences, and what you want to know is what's true of people in general, not of any particular person. And then after having witnessed these kinds of things, right, we can have them view a lineup. And once again, because we created the event, and that's a powerful thing in science, to be able to create the phenomena that you're trying to study, right, then we know who the real perp is in this lineup. Perp, he's one of our people, if it's any of them, right? And what that means is that when we get, for example, identification decisions, we can score these decisions for whether they're right or wrong definitively. We have the ground truth, right? And we can measure other things like how confident are they in that identification, and how willing do they say they would be to testify in support of that identification. We can look at how long it takes them to make the identification, and what does that tell us about the likelihood that it's accurate, and so on and so forth. So you take this basic paradigm, right, and then you can go in and begin to randomly assign people to various versions of this paradigm, right, to manipulate things like characteristics of the witnessed event. Good view, poor view, from a distance, bad lighting, good lighting, and things like that, as well as characteristics of the eyewitnesses, young, old, black, white, male, female, and so on, to see what difference that makes. You can manipulate things like the pre-lineup instructions, which turn out to be very important, and I'll mention that in a while. Characteristics of the lineup, for example, whether the perpetrator's there or not, how many people are in that lineup, how close do the other people, the fillers, look to the person who you are treating as the suspect in that lineup, things like that. So you begin to develop a science out of this, right? Behaviors of the lineup administrator, which turns out to be one of the hidden problems that the legal system really didn't know much about at all at the time. And, how do those affect the person who's administering this line? How does that affect the identification decision that's made, the confidence, and so on and so forth, right? So this paradigm then is pretty rich, pretty powerful. It gives us a lot of degrees of freedom to get in and start pulling together a literature. And Saul mentioned this. I'll mention it again just to give you some examples of system and estimator variables. So within this, back in 1978, I actually wrote that article, which was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology on system variables, estimator variables. I started it in 1977 at the age of 26. And the audacity of me to publish such an article at that point, it seemed to be very radical, less so today. But where I made this distinction, estimator variables being those that do affect the reliability of eyewitness evidence over which the justice system has no control, right? So, for example, they're important variables like witnessing distance and lighting and exposure duration, same versus other race. Other race identifications are more difficult than within race, right? Stress, fear, arousal impair performance. There's something called the weapon focus. But the legal system can't do anything about that. There either was or wasn't a weapon involved. It was either a cross-racial identification attempt or it wasn't. They're not controlling that. Whereas the system variables, and this is why I preferred and have tended to have a bias myself ever since I wrote the article, and it comes across in the article, for variables that affect the reliability of eyewitness identification, over which the justice system does, or at least should, have control. It should take control of these things if it doesn't already, right? Separating the witnesses, pre-lineup interviews, pre-lineup instructions to witnesses, characteristics of the lineup fillers, verbal and nonverbal behaviors of the lineup administrators, the records of the witnesses' responses. These are all things that are system variables over which the justice system has control. And if they have control and they influence the reliability of eyewitnesses, then they should be exerting that control and gain control over it. So it's an important concept. As we were building this literature, then throughout the 1980s, so starting in the 70s for the most part, going through the 80s and getting into the 90s, we were blowing the whistle about eyewitness identification evidence. You look at those articles, we were blowing the whistle in various ways. We were saying different kinds of things. We're doing these experiments and saying, oh my God, look at this, right? That witnesses are easily prone to error. They're sensitive to very slight, even variations in identification procedure and how it's conducted. They're less reliable than people think. People are surprised about how often they make these errors and so on. So we were trying to get this word out and kind of blowing this whistle. But until the mid-90s, this experimental literature in eyewitness identification had little impact at all, except for an occasional, somebody's getting into the courtroom to give some expert testimony in some locations across the country. Otherwise, it was largely ignored by the legal system, right? And, when you press them on why, you get responses like, well, these are not real eyewitnesses. Well, okay. Real eyewitnesses, we're too cautious to make these mistakes. Okay. Fear and arousal from sticking a real gun in your face or being assaulted. You're not assaulting people in your experiments. Well, no, we can't get that by our IRBs, right? Or we would. And so, although they didn't use these words, sort of like pointy-headed academic studies, not the real world. But then what happened was the advent of forensic DNA testing starting in the mid-90s, and things began to change. That was a huge turning point. It changed the situation, especially starting around 1997, when we began to take a look at forensic DNA tests of people who were serving hard time, some on death row, and it turns out for crimes they did not commit. Innocent people, all of a sudden, are starting to get exonerated. People like Kirk Bloodsworth. This is from an article this is the first peer-reviewed article on DNA exonerations, which we published in 1998. It's the APLS, American Psychology Law Society, white paper that Saul was referring to. Kirk Bloodsworth was convicted of murder and rape in 1985. He was sentenced to death. It was later reduced to life on a technicality. He served 9 years before forensic DNA testing came along and proved him innocent. he had never been in trouble with the law in his life. A very great, a nice guy from Maryland who served his country very well in the Navy. But what sent him to death row initially? 5 witnesses mistakenly identified. And when you look down the right-hand column, we were asking, like, what are these DNA exonerations? What's driving them? And what's driving them is mistaken eyewitness identification, right? So that was looking at the first 40. Today, there are 349 of these DNA exonerations. Well, as of last week sometime, 258 involve cases of mistaken eyewitness identification. So about, 74, 75, about 3 out of every 4 of these DNA exonerations turn out to be mistaken eyewitness identification. Now, on here, here's 99 of those individuals. I've met all of these people. I've met more of the exonerated people, but I can't fit them all on the slide. There's Kirk Bloodsworth right there, right? Now, this is a small slice of the cases, and this is really important. A very small slice of the cases, and it has to be a small slice of the cases, and here's why. Because when, and you can and work with the Innocence Projects, and you see this, there are people in prison who are claiming that they were innocent, they were mistakenly ID'd, and so on and so forth. Almost none of them is there any DNA evidence to be analyzed. Why? Because the biological evidence wasn't collected, or because the biological evidence was not collected properly, or because it was destroyed, or it was because it deteriorated, if there was any biological evidence taken from the scene, and because light and heat are enemies of that evidence, so it really should be refrigerated, or the biological evidence was lost, or, and this is the huge category, there was no biological evidence. Turns out the world's not CSI at all, right? That's fiction. It's pretty rare. And when I went through these slides, showing you the DNA exoneration cases, I don't know if you noticed, they're virtually all cases of sexual assault. Maybe sexual assault plus robbery or sexual assault plus murder, but sexual assault was involved. Why? Well, not because they're sexual assault witnesses are bad witnesses. They're probably among the best we have because they get better view, longer view, and so on than most crimes, but because that's where the DNA is, right? That could prove that, that could be exculpatory, right? So, in fact, it's only a small fraction of cases that can be solved with DNA tests. It's rare to have definitive biological rich DNA trace evidence for murders, muggings, burglaries, drive-by shootings. How excited is this guy going to have to be robbing the 7-Eleven to leave behind that kind of evidence, right? So it's not likely to happen. And if you get mistakenly identified and the witness shows themselves to be confident, you're in trouble because chances are there's no DNA to come to your rescue, and it takes something pretty much that definitive to trump an eyewitness. Now here's another, I'm going to get back to the experiments because that's where we learn the most, I believe. But I want to point to something that has evolved over the last several years, and we're building a larger database on this. And this is field studies of actual lineups. So working with police departments, researchers going out and saying, hey, we want to see what happens with every lineup you do. We want to know how it comes out. This is really very interesting for the following reason. At one point, we were sort of like, what can we learn? We can't really learn much from that. We can only learn from experiments. Well, sort of. But what happens is when you properly construct a lineup, it has one person who's a suspect, who may or may not be the perpetrator, and everybody else is a known innocent filler, right? Like Officer Krupke stands in the lineup and, in place of somebody, right? For identifications of the suspect, let's say this is the suspect in the lineup who may or may not be the perpetrator. We don't know. If the witness picks him, we don't know if that's right or wrong. But what we do know is whenever the witness picks one of these people, a filler, a foil, if you will, right? A distractor, if you want to call them that. And we call them fillers because law enforcement calls them fillers. We know the eyewitness is mistaken. So an interesting question is, well, how often does that happen with these real cases? And that turns out to speak back to this criticism of the lab studies, right? So here are the 11, you can't see this, I'm going to summarize, 11 published field studies of actual eyewitnesses to serious crimes. Some of these witnesses are victims, some are bystanders. The crimes are very serious. And these are police going about the task of doing their lineups, all right? And there are altogether 6,734 lineups that have been examined across these 11 published experiments. And let's take a look at how they distribute out. So 2,746 of those 6,734, the suspect was identified. We don't know if it's right or wrong, but the suspect was identified. That's about 41%. Not very high. The eyewitness made no identification about 35% of the time, 36% of the time. And look at this. One out of every four times, almost one out of every four, 23.7% times that a lineup was conducted, the eyewitness picked a known innocent person. You know immediately, you're not charging them, right, because they're fillers. But wow. And if you look at it this way, which I think is even more interesting, of those who made an ID, so just of those who went ahead and said, number 3 or number 1, right? What percent were of fillers, known innocent fillers? 37%. So 1 out of every 3 witnesses who attempts an ID and makes an affirmative response in a lineup is demonstrably mistaken, right? And these data are pretty consistent. Here's the range on those studies, ranging from, for 11 studies, and by the way, these run all the way from Northern California to London, England. So for that, that's pretty consistent. I mean, 22 to 49% being that range. So I want to return, though, then, I mean, it tells us that, look, this argument that, oh, real witnesses would be too cautious to make these kinds of errors. Really? They're doing it as we speak, left and right. I don't see the caution against this. It's happening over and over again, right? But I want to return to the experiments because here's the thing that you want to remember about the experiments is that it's not the overall level of error in the experiments that has ever interested us. It never interested us that much from the very beginning because we don't think we can generalize necessarily about the overall level of error. What's important to us is highly replicable patterns of error that are interest because that's where principles, scientific principles are contained. They're contained in patterns. They're not contained in the absolute value of anything, right? So let me tell you about a super replicable, very easy to replicate kind of phenomenon that it took me a while to figure out how to show this, but here's the simple version of it. And it's a process or phenomenon that I called the relative judgment process, and you'll see why in a second. And it just simply says this. It says, hey, look, you know, eyewitnesses tend to select the person who looks most like the memory of the perpetrator relative to the other members of the lineup, right? Seems harmless enough, but let me show you that it's not. It's the big problem, right? So here's what we did. We did an experiment where we staged a crime 200 times for 200 separate witnesses. And for 100 of them, randomly determined, they either saw this or one I'll show you in a second of this lineup. And all of these witnesses were warned that the actual perpetrator might not be in the lineup, right? And by the way, in every DNA exoneration case, the real perpetrator was not in the lineup, right? In every DNA exoneration case. So we already knew there's a problem here. But so what we, so they were told that the actual perpetrator might not be in the lineup. And then, indeed, what happens here is that 21% make no choice. Well, the real perpetrator is in this lineup. I mean, he's not really a perpetrator, he's one of our people, but, 54% of the witnesses were able to pick him out. That's not the phenomenon, because that's an absolute number. Like, we need to compare it to something, right? And, I mean, we can compare it to these people, but that's not quite what I mean. What we wanted to know is what happens if you take this guy, for the other 100 of the witnesses, eliminate him from the lineup, replace him with no one, a removal without replacement procedure, right? Give him exactly the same instructions, right? We don't put an X to him, he's really not there, right? All the witnesses are warned the actual perpetrator might not be there. And the question is, where does the 54% go? Because it has to go someplace, right? These all have to total 100%. And one possibility now is that since he's not there, nobody can pick that square, that this 54% slides down here, joins the 21. So now you have 75% saying, making no choice, saying, I don't think the guy's there, or I can't be sure enough to pick anybody, right? But that's not what happens. It's not 54%. In this initial experiment, and the numbers themselves vary, but the phenomenon itself replicates over and over again. It's not 54% that goes down there, only 11%. And the dominant tendency is to go to the next best guy, right? That's the problem with relative judgments. Now, other people pick up some percent too, because to them, the next best guy might be somebody else. But so the idea is that they're picking the person who looks most like the perpetrator relative to the others, right? And the problem with that is somebody's always going to look more like the perpetrator than the other people in the lineup, even when the real perp's not there. And it's not unusual for the real perp not to be there. It turns out there are no rules, no laws, no policies in police departments about when can you put together a lineup. Anytime you want, right? Like, well, maybe Joe did it. We'll throw him into a lineup, right? You don't have to have evidence, right? And so it's not surprising, perhaps, that in at least one jurisdiction that was recently analyzed, what it looks like is the perpetrator was absent from the lineup 65% of all the lineups they did, right? So that's a problem. One of the things the ways I used to talk about this is it's really difficult for witnesses to recognize the absence of the perpetrator. It's hard to see that he's not there. That's a difficult task, right? There are a number of implications of this propensity to make relative judgments. One is, this is why it's critical to warn witnesses that the culprit might not be in the lineup, and to give them an option for saying, I don't know, or saying, I don't think he's there. We did that in that experiment. It helps. It doesn't completely take care of it. So this helps, but it doesn't clean it up completely. And this is why lineup fillers need to be selected carefully so that they fit the description of the culprit and their significant features. Because if you create, let's say, a lineup like this, and I'll show you here in a second, I mean, where the suspect is the only one who really fits that description, right? Then you're going into it guaranteed that that person's going to look more like the culprit than the other people, whether he's innocent or guilty, right? So it's a problematic type lineup. Here, the witness described the perpetrator as a white male, slight build, early 30s, dark hair just over the ears, clean shaven, about 6'2". Well, that's not clean shaven or dark hair just over the ears, right? Not dark hair just over the ears, not clean shaven or dark hair just over. So it's between these two guys. But notice they left the height lines in the background at 6'2", right? And that was indeed the person they were focused on. Well, one of the things that I think implicitly a lot of people did, and we made it explicit in an article in 1992, was to say, you know what? We can draw an analogy between police conducting a lineup and psychologists conducting a research experiment. And it goes like this. In an experiment, we have these ideas like, okay, there's an experimenter and there's a hypothesis, and you create a design and you run participants and you give them instructions and you take various measures and you get results and then you interpret, right? And we know a lot about experiments, and we know what makes experiments go bad, right? We know about the rules of experiments. Well, a lineup is like an experiment. The experimenter is the police investigator. The police investigator has a hypothesis that this suspect is the culprit and creates a design, called a lineup by taking the suspect and embedding that suspect among fillers, and then that detectives, that police investigator or experimenters, participants or subjects are the eyewitnesses or eyewitness, right? And then there are instructions to be given, for example, that the culprit might or might not be in the lineup. There are measures to be taken, like the ID decision of the witness and how confident they are. There are results to be examined then, because they did one of three things. They either identified the suspect, they identified a filler, or they made no ID. And then there's an interpretation to be reached when the detective is done, right? Like to increase or decrease their belief that the suspect is the culprit. In other words, reflect back on the hypothesis given the results. What's powerful about this analogy is that it arms psychologists to who've had experimental training to be experts right from the outset on lineups, because all the things that can go wrong with an experiment can go wrong with a lineup. Biased instructions, right, that suggest to the witness that the person is there when they might not be. Cross-participant contamination. In other words, in the case of, well, these are, let's see, is this the one? No. Let me come back. What are examples of cross-participant contamination? Well, letting two witnesses interact, before they view the lineup, or one of them views the lineup and interacts with the other witness before the other witness views the lineup. Confoundings, like if the suspect stands out, that may be a reason why they were picked. Selective reporting of data, which is a huge problem, where law enforcement agencies, they're not really working these lineups like it were a scientific experiment, because if the results don't come out the way they want, they don't write a report on it. These lineups suddenly start to disappear. Overcommitment to a prior theory, in other words, and ignoring disconfirming evidence, which also happens with scientists, right? So you get a result you don't like, right? And you don't reduce your belief that the suspect was the culprit. Like, no, I still think he's the culprit. Wait a minute, you just took in evidence, you should revise it, right? And things like that. So out of that comes various ideas. For example, it's really out of this kind of conceptualization that I came up with the idea of the double-blind lineup. Who should administer the lineup? Because the default practice in eyewitness identification is for it to be done by the case detective. The case detective decides, okay, I think maybe Joe did it, puts together some kind of identification procedure with Joe in it, and that same case detective administers it to the witness. Not with a defense counsel present or something, because there's no right to defense counsel present. It's the witness and the detective in a room going over pictures. The case detective's invested in the outcome and knows very well which person is the suspect and which are fillers. So, so the idea is the double-blind lineup. A single-blind lineup, we assume, right? Single-blind means the person being tested isn't told, what condition they're in, right? Similarly, eyewitness is not told which lineup member is suspected of the culprit and which are known innocent fillers. We assume that. We assume that police aren't saying, Mrs. Jones, I'm going to show you a lineup to see if you can pick out number 3, right? But what the system has completely ignored is the idea that it really needs to be double-blind. Which is not only single-blind, but also the person who administers the lineup does not know which person in that lineup is suspected of being the culprit and which are the known innocent fillers, because we're trying to prevent this unintentional influence of the administrator on the eyewitness. And we all know, and you can see where this just comes right straight out of the analogy of lineups as experiments, right? Let's have police do these more like scientific experiments instead of how they're doing them, right? And so what we're trying to do, imagine yourself, and I say that these are unintentional errors, and I think for the most part they are. Imagine yourself the detective, right? You've placed your suspect into position 3. You know that number 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6 are just fillers, okay? And then what you do is you show it to the witness, and the witness says, number 2, what are you going to do? Nothing? Or are you going to be human and go, Now, be sure you look at everyone, right? Take your time. Don't be hasty, right? Because it's like, did you even look at my guy, right? That's what they're thinking, and so, like, you can't hold back. You really can't help yourself. But let's suppose instead, the witness says, number 3. What are you going to do? You're going to say, now, take your time. No. No, it's, tell me about number 3, right? Or, and this was the case that led me to really begin to push the double blind. The eyewitness said nothing for a period of time. Not uncommon, tough task, looking at a photo lineup, right? Says nothing, and we learn later, both the detective and the witness admitted this, that the detective said, I noticed you paused on number 3. Now, I got to know that detective, good guy, meant no harm. I'm convinced of that. I think she did pause on number 3. I think she paused also on numbers 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6. But the pause to 3 seemed longer to the detective because the detective has this extra knowledge, right? That's the last person you want interpreting the behavior of the witness, right, as somebody who has some hypothesis about what's going on there because they know which one's the suspect. We've been looking at eyewitness certainty for a long time, and it turns out that the certainty that an eyewitness expresses is so important because it's the primary factor that determines the credibility of that witness in everybody's eyes, the jurors, the prosecutors, the judges, right? So a certain witness is a very powerful witness, right? And what we've been concerned with is false certainty. False certainty is a situation in which the eyewitness is positive or nearly positive and yet wrong. Every DNA exoneration, mistaken ID case is like that. At trial, the witness is positive, wrong, but positive, right? So false certainty. Some of this false certainty occurs on its own. Originally, we were kind of thinking like, wow, that's interesting. Look at this false certainty, occurs on its own. But mostly, it turns out, it's created by the legal system itself and can be prevented. It doesn't come that naturally to witnesses, right? And the key to understanding how the system creates false certainty is to recognize that witnesses can be influenced even after they've made an identification from the lineup. Witness says, number 3, good, you identified the suspect, right? Witness says, number 4, yes, you got him, right? Perfectly legal, perfectly legitimate kinds of responses to the witness's choice. Once again, an actual case got me into looking at this, where the defense attorney said, I know my client's innocent, but the witness seems to be positive in a pretrial testimony, right? And I said, well, maybe you've got nothing to lose at this point except to ask her, what, if anything, did the detectives, because there were 3 detectives in the room who administered a photo lineup to her, say or do when you pointed to number 3? I keep saying number 3 because that's where most detectives put the person, right? And she said they clapped, right? So we wanted to know, what does this do, right? So we created what's called the post-identification feedback paradigm. Amy, at that time Bradfield, now Douglas, is here in the audience. And so it's pretty straightforward. What happens is we have people witness an event. They make an ID decision. In the data that I'm going to show you in this particular experiment, all these ID decisions are incorrect. Every ID is a mistake because he's not really there. We're just generating a lot of mistaken IDs here. And then we randomly, at basically the flip of a coin, give them feedback. And the feedback either is, good, you identified the suspect, right? We're not clapping, we're not doing cartwheels, but it's good, you identified the suspect. Or nothing, right? And notice that this feedback occurs after they've already made their decision, right? And then we ask them questions about the witnessed event, and we ask them questions about the decision they made. they're asked things like, how certain were you, and look at the wording here, at the time of your identification, the time you made your identification, that you identified the real gunman, right? What we call retrospective certainty. Think back to your identification. How certain were you at that time? Well, at that time, they hadn't gotten feedback, right? We also ask, like, how good was the view you had of the gunman? How closely you were paying attention? There's a whole list. There's about 15 items here that get used sort of routinely now in this work, but these are some of the critical items, right? And let me show you some results. This is a little bit of an unusual way of displaying data, but this is the percentage of witnesses at the high extreme. In other words, the percentage of witnesses, remember, they're all wrong, they're all mistaken, who claim to be, that they were highly certain, that they were positive or nearly positive at the time of the ID, or that said they had a great view of the face. So that's what the y-axis here, the percent at that extreme, right? And what happens is, in the control condition, in this particular experiment, about 11 or 12% say that they were positive or nearly positive at the time of their identification. That's a little higher than we usually get. That's false confidence, but we didn't create it. We don't know where that came from exactly, right? But look what happens to those who just had a statement uttered to them after they made their ID. Good, you identified the suspect. Now what happens is over 45% or so report that they were positive or nearly positive at the time they made their ID. They weren't, of course. It's the control condition that would tell us how positive they should have been. That now they're saying they had a great view, when in fact they had a lousy view. And we can see from the other people in the control condition how lousy their view was. So this is manufactured false certainty. This wasn't the fault of the witness. This is the fault of a system that allows witnesses to be reinforced at the time they make an ID, and then have the audacity to ask them after telling them that they picked the suspect, by the way, how sure are you, right? It's ridiculous, right? This is not, it's, in the lineups as experiments analogy, this is like debriefing your participants before you've taken all the measures, right? Now, let me move quickly through. This is a variation of this. This is, I really think this goes to the heart of the issue of post-identification feedback. So we had people, this is a study that Laura Smallars did. Individually witness event, make an identification from a lineup that was either right or wrong. So now some of them are right. But then they're randomly assigned to get feedback confirming that ID or not. So you have basically a 2-by-2 kind of thing. Here you got accurate and inaccurate witnesses who either get confirming feedback or no feedback. And then what happens is they get cross-examined. All right? So we do this over and over again, cross-examining them by someone who doesn't know, did they make an accurate ID or not, right? And then other people then later view these videotapes of the cross-examinations and try to determine, were they right or were they wrong? And so what happens here is that, is this. So this is the percentages of witnesses who believe with no feedback to the witness, percentage of testimony observers on the tapes who believe the witness. And you can see they are well above chance in being able to discern between an accurate and a mistaken witness, right? Unless these witnesses got confirming feedback, so that's an index of their accuracy, unless the witnesses got confirming feedback, in which case they can't tell the difference, right? So the problem with this, allowing that kind of feedback, is that it wipes out the cues that a jury or others might use to decide, hey, is that a good witness or not a good witness, right? We've had a lot of impact on the legal system. Today, all states, with the exception of one, permit expert testimony in criminal civil cases. I won't name that state. I'll give you a hint. It starts with L and rhymes with Louisiana. But otherwise, no. State Supreme Courts in various places like New Jersey, Oregon, and Massachusetts have formally changed how they go about making judgments about whether eyewitness identification evidence is admissible based on the research that we've done in psychology. And a large portion of the more than 17,000 law enforcement agencies in the U.S. have adopted, either voluntarily or been forced to, a core set of reforms for eyewitness identification procedures. What are those core sets of reforms? It's basically what we sort of call the core five. You can only have one suspect. Everybody else has to be a filler. You have to select them so that the suspect doesn't stand out. You have to use a double-blind administrator. You have to instruct them that the culprit might not be present and that they don't need to choose anyone, and you have to secure a confidence statement from them using the double-blind administrator, and that's a matter of record. And so that's the sort of core five. And there are more that we're trying to get these jurisdictions to adopt, but this has been pretty successful. It's been adopted by the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the U.S. Department of Justice. It's mandatory by statute or court ruling or executive order in all of these states. It's quasi-mandatory in these states, and I could tell you what that means, but basically it's almost as much force as when it's mandatory. So there's been a lot of change. It came about clearly, in large part, we were greatly helped by the DNA exonerations, but also media. Media has been our friend on this. And I just give you an example, like when I was on Oprah, it was amazing her reach, because for weeks later I would be getting phone calls out of the blue from like some police chief in some small town someplace saying, hey, I heard about this idea of, having a good protocol for lineups and blah, 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 blah. And, and then at some point he'd say, well, let me tell you, here's how I found out. My wife was watching Oprah, and like, what? This is our path to changing the legal system, like through Oprah? Anyway. Collaboration with innocence projects across the country and individuals in law enforcement, and working with key people in all these states, and making presentations to judges and prosecutors and police and so on. I'm sorry, I meant to leave more time. We've got like 2 minutes at most for questions, although I will hang around afterwards outside here. But I've got to cut it off. The clock is ticking down fast. Thank you very much.